Welcome to Witness to Yesterday, the Canadian history podcast of the Champlain Society. My name is Larry Ostola. In an address to Parliament in 1961, President John F. Kennedy famously declared that geography has made us neighbors, history has made us friends, economics has made us partners, and necessity has made us allies. What unites us is far greater than what divides us. Much has been written about what has been referred to as the special relationship between Canada and the United States. To delve into it, I'm delighted to be joined today by Don Abelson, who's the co-editor, along with Stephen Brooks, of a recent book titled History Has Made Us Friends, Reassessing the Special Relationship Between Canada and the United States, published by McGill Queen's University Press. Donald Abelson is a professor of Canada-U.S. Relations and Political Science at McMaster University. From 2019 to 2023, he served as inaugural director of the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government, Stephen K. Hudson Chair in Canada-U.S. Relations, and professor of political science at St. Francis Xavier University. He's the author of over a dozen books, including Understanding American Politics, and he's a regular contributor to dozens of media outlets in North America, Europe, and the Middle East. Don, many thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
My pleasure to be with you, Larry.
When did the term special relationship first begin to emerge with respect to the ties between Canada and the United States? And what is it typically taken to mean?
Well, it's a great question, and it was one of the many reasons why Steve Brooks and I decided to co-edit this volume. The term special relationship is often used to describe Canada's relations with the United States. That began to emerge, I would say, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, certainly post-war era. But ironically, when you talk to Americans about their special relationship, they're really not referring to Canada, they're referring to Great Britain. And so one of the reasons why Steve and I wanted to delve into this was we often hear or we often read that the Canada-US relationship is described as close, enduring, important, of course, but the term special is often left out. Joe Biden left it out in his first virtual chat with Justin Trudeau. And we began to question what special really means in an economic sense, politically, militarily, in terms of environmental cooperation. And I think given what happened during the first term of the Trump presidency and into the second, we began to realize that it was time to really take a temperature of the Canada-US relationship and figure out exactly what was going on.
Let's go back a little bit in time then, because a significant moment in the Canada-US relationship occurred in Kingston in 1938. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was visiting, and he made something known as the Kingston Dispensation. What was it, and why was it important?
Well, it was very important, and you're absolutely right. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was visiting Kingston, Ontario, in fact, gave a very important speech at my alma mater, Queen's University. And the remarks that FDR made at the time were intended to really lay the groundwork, lay the foundation for what would become a very strong organization built around defense cooperation between Canada and the United States. We know that both Canada and the United States were deeply concerned after the Second World War that they have the ability to track and monitor the possibility of Soviet bombers coming in our direction. And eventually, this concern led to the creation of what was then NORAD, the North American Air Command Defense, and now has become the North American Aerospace Defense Command. And so the speech was historically important. It's one of the issues that we often lose sight of in terms of how much interaction there is between the two countries. But defense cooperation constitutes a major pillar in our relationship with the U.S.
In the introduction to your book, you cite the work of a scholar named Charles Doran, who made the case that the relationship between Canada and the U.S. really has few parallels, and he described it as operating on two rails. One he called structural, and the second he referred to as involving politics and policy. What are the two rails? How are they defined?
Well, Chuck Duran was one of the most prominent, still alive, but really in his heyday, among the most prominent scholars in the United States who focus on the bilateral relationship. And he would agree that the bilateral relationship between Canada and the United States is one of the most important relationships on the globe. So when he drew a distinction between the structural dimension to the Canada-US relationship and the political dimension, structurally he was talking about the extent to which the two countries are interconnected in terms of trade, in terms of defense, in terms of energy, in terms of the environment. And so as JFK pointed out in 1961, given our geography, given the extent of our trade relationship with the United States, we trade in excess of $1 billion in trade and goods and services each day, two-way trade. It really has become the most important bilateral relationship on the globe. Politically, of course, that's a whole different matter. And at times, as we've seen throughout the course of the Canada-US relationship, our prime ministers have not necessarily gotten along well with American presidents. Politics has gotten in the way. And it really takes powerful leaders that have courage, have vision, and have a determination to maintain this very, very important relationship. We could go back to Mike Lester B. Pearson. We could talk about John Diefenbaker. We could talk about Jean Chrétien and George W. Bush. But for us, the gold standard in prime ministerial U.S. presidential relations was when Brian Mulroney was in office from 1985 to 1993. And whatever people thought of Mulroney at the time, he firmly believed that Canada's status on the world stage ultimately depended on how close our relationship was with the United States. And so he had an extremely important relationship with Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, and for a brief period of time, Bill Clinton. And that allowed him to try and deal with political differences at the time. And as you know, there were some very controversial issues: free trade, Star Wars, which was unveiled to the American public on March 23rd, 1983. So a few years later, Mulroney had to deal with that, acid rain, and others. So having that close bond between a prime minister, a Canadian prime minister, and a US president can be extremely, extremely important and valuable to us.
There was a story in the book that really struck me, and I hadn't heard it before, about the relationship between President Reagan and Prime Minister Mulroney. There was a meeting called of G5 nations to which Canada wasn't invited, and I'm paraphrasing now, but at some point, either at the start of the meeting or during the meeting, President Reagan is said to have said that if this is going to be a club that won't accept Brian as a member, then I don't think I want to be a member of it either. And I thought, wow, having friends in high places can be incredibly useful. And so I was struck by that story, but I wanted to ask you specifically about how their personal relationship came into play with respect to another issue, and that was the voyage of the ship known as the Polar Sea. What happened in that case?
So the Polar Sea referred to a U.S. Coast Guard icebreaker, and this incident took place around 1985. And the ship decided to make a voyage from Greenland to Alaska and had to pass through the Northwest Passage to make that trip. The American government, the U.S. Coast Guard, for whatever reason, decided not to inform Canadian authorities. And when the Canadian authorities found out what was happening, they raised this issue with Washington. Of course, there wasn't a exchange of fire, anything like that, but it brought to the surface a very important issue that continues to this day, which is America's claim that the Northwest Passage constitutes an international waterway, and Canada's position that we have sovereignty, complete and utter sovereignty in the Arctic. And so an interesting story developed from that point. Ronald Reagan was making a state visit to Canada around 1985, shortly after this happened. And he was in Mulroney's office, the prime minister's office. And when the press were there, he called Ronald Reagan over to this antique globe, which was on a stand. It's now at the Mulroney Institute at St. FX in the replica of the prime minister's office. And he called Reagan over and he pointed to the Northwest Passage and he said, "Ron, that belongs to us, lock, stock, and icebergs." And Reagan laughed, but it has been an ongoing issue that has preoccupied leaders on both sides of the border. Canada has been relentless in his claims to control Arctic sovereignty. But it was one of those issues that if you had a different type of leadership between a Reagan and Mulroney, and let's say it was Donald Trump and a Justin Trudeau, the outcome would have been very, very different. And that's why I and other scholars are beginning to write a lot more about the politics of friendship and how that can help leaders both facilitate cooperation and manage dissent, especially when national politics can get in the way.
Well, that idea of the relationship between a president and prime minister is fascinating. Of course, as you well know, and many listeners know, there were occasions when things weren't quite as positive. I'm thinking of an incident between LBJ and Prime Minister Pearson, which didn't turn out quite as amicably.
No, it did not. And Mike Pearson, and I should mention that of all the prime ministers in Canada, and yeah, I was able to work with Prime Minister Mulroney for close to 5 years, and he loved Mike Pearson. For him, Mike Pearson, Lester B. Pearson, really was the model that should be followed for future prime ministers. He just absolutely had the greatest respect and admiration for him. But Mike Pearson had made a visit to Washington. This was in the mid 1960s during the civil rights and anti war protests going on throughout the US, and was giving a speech on the Vietnam War at Howard University. And he was quite critical of American involvement, calling for an end to hostilities. In fact, was quite critical of the Johnson administration and what he considered to be their mishandling of the conflict. And shortly after the speech, Mike Pearson went for a visit to see LBJ. And the story is, and has been verified by many people who were in the room at the time, that LBJ, who was quite a tall man, 6 feet, probably 4 or 5 inches, and Lester Pearson, as you know, was much shorter stature, literally picked him up by the lapels. His feet were dangling in the air, and basically said to Pearson, "Don't you ever again come into my tent and basically urinate on my lawn." And it was obviously his way of saying, "Don't you ever do something like that again." And I know, having read diplomatic accounts of this, that many of Pearson's aides and security were about to intervene. They did not, and LBJ returned Mike Pearson to the floor, but it was a very, very spirited and provocative action.
We've now talked about the relationship at the top, fair enough. But in the 1980s, there was what is referred to in the book as an increased professionalization of Canada's advocacy efforts down in the United States, which was carried on into the present day, really. And what was the nature of the professionalization? Why was it necessary? Why did it come about?
It came about largely because there was a growing recognition that advocating for Canada south of the border was a hard sell. That with all the issues that were being discussed on Capitol Hill, in the US House of Representatives, in the US Senate, and of course in the executive branch, that it was difficult to get Canada on the radar. And so there was a decision made fairly early on in the Mulroney government, with the cooperation and strong support of Alan Gottlieb, who was one of our ambassadors to the United States, that Canada had to invest more time and more resources basically lobbying in Washington, working with professional lobbyists, working with staffers on Capitol Hill, working with non governmental organizations, think tanks that had as a principal area of focus the Canada US relationship, working with other bodies, chambers of commerce, two-thirds of American states with their governors that had Canada as their principal export market. And so the decision was made that we had to up our game, that we couldn't just take for granted that because we were the neighbor and we were involved in different agreements, that that would take care of itself. So there was a strong commitment to more professionalization, a more systematic approach to getting to know the internal workings of Washington, who to contact, who had a voice, who was in, who was out, and to position ourselves more strategically and more effectively on the American political landscape. And I can tell you, having spent, the bulk of my adult years studying Canada-US relations and have spoken to many prime ministers, no one had a better inside knowledge of all the pressure points in Washington than Brian Mulroney. And I don't say this for partisan reasons. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm strictly nonpartisan. But he had a unique take on the United States. And of course, when Justin Trudeau ran into trouble during the renegotiation of the NAFTA, who did he call upon to advocate for Canada and to get the deal through when he was having difficulty with the Trump administration? It was Brian Mulroney. And people listened to him. He had a great track record in DC, and they knew what he said was important and worthy of attention.
He could obviously get the meeting and help us in our efforts to work the room.
Absolutely. And he used to say to me, one of the many advantages of having the kind of close relationship he enjoyed with both Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, he could literally walk into the Oval Office anytime he wanted. And I remember him telling me this fascinating story. He was on a plane, I think it was to Nelson Mandela's funeral. I could be wrong about the context, but he was sitting beside Frank Carlucci, who was a very powerful man in Washington during the Mulroney years, and headed up the National Security Council, and just knew Mulroney quite well because of the number of meetings he had had with American presidents. And he said to Mulroney, "I've got to tell you something, Brian. The old man," and he was referring to Ronald Reagan, he said, "the old man loved you so much. Hell, he would have given you the dome off the Capitol building. All you had to do was ask." So was that special, getting back to your first question, that special relationship nurtured over time that really gave Canada a strong foothold and stature. And your question before about the G5, when Brian Mulroney found out that Canada had not been invited to be a member of the G5, which was a smaller meeting, of course, of the G7, focused on economic affairs, it didn't seem to faze Pierre Trudeau, who was prime minister at the time, but it made Prime Minister Mulroney go apoplectic. And so he said to Ronald Reagan before the G7 converted into the G5 that Canada was left out. And the story was that Ronald Reagan stood up and said to the remaining members of the G7, "If Brian's not good enough to be a member of the G5, well, I guess neither are we." And he slapped his leather portfolio together and then slammed it on the table and basically said, "If he's not in, either is the United States." And that's how Canada became a member of the G5. And I think Mulroney was absolutely shocked at the time that the president of the United States had Canada's back at an international meeting that provided Canada again with unparalleled access to decisions that would not only affect continental integration, but our stature on the world stage. He never forgot.
No, an amazing story. And that leads me to another event on the world stage, which was hugely significant. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapses, and we essentially move from a bipolar world, with the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States, to a unipolar world with the United States leading the way and being the leading power. What was the effect, if any, that it had on the Canada-US relationship, that move from bipolar to unipolar?
Well, one of the things that happened was it actually gave Canada, in many ways, a much stronger voice, particularly in the United States, which then translated into more influence, I believe, globally. Prime Minister Mulroney had a wonderful relationship with President George H.W. Bush. They vacationed together each year. Their families were very close. Mulroney would go to Kennebunkport every summer. And I had some of his aides tell me it was just a remarkable relationship to watch unfold because he would say, for hours, it would just be meetings between President Bush and Prime Minister Mulroney, and they would be able to map out together what efforts had to be taken on the world stage in Europe with Gorbachev, with Margaret Thatcher, with other people, Helmut Kohl, who played a very, very important role. And, this aide said to me more than once, he said, I was watching world history unfold in front of me. And so I think when we went from a bipolar to a unipolar world, it actually gave us more voice in large part because of our connection to the United States and with a president who greatly admired our prime minister. And a lot of people, a lot of your listeners might not know this because we tend to exaggerate the relationship that Prime Minister Mulroney had with Ronald Reagan, and we underestimate the importance of the relationship Brian Mulroney had with George H.W. Bush. Indeed, his relationship with Bush was far stronger and in many ways far more meaningful. And President Bush was asked once, President Bush, in all your years in public service, who was your most trusted advisor? His response, Brian Mulroney.
That's high praise indeed.
High praise. And then it allowed, Prime Minister Mulroney to emphasize the importance of giving Gorbachev a chance, providing financial aid, not having the Soviet Union as an adversary, but bringing it along as a result of perestroika and glasnost to become part of the community of nations. And so it was that ear that Prime Minister had to President Bush that allowed Canada's support for the progress and evolution of key world strategies to unfold.
One question I really wanted to get at, which comes up in the book, is how the notion of a special relationship with the United States plays into Canadian nationalism. I mean, we see this today in terms of some of the currents that are running through the country. My reading is that it results in a bit of a strange tension. I mean, we're always interested to see whether or not Canada will get the first call and Canada will get the first visit. But then on the other hand, we worry about American influence and the real or perceived effects that that has on our independence. How do you see that dynamic playing out?
Let me begin by saying that prime ministers who enter office, and Mulroney said this many, many times, as have other prime ministers, the most important file that a Canadian prime minister has to deal with, other than the one on federal provincial relations, is the Canada US relationship. The problem is that our prime ministers have to walk a tightrope. On the one hand, they understand and appreciate the importance of a close bilateral relationship, particularly with respect to trade and defense, environmental cooperation, energy, and other things. We get that. And until we are able to reduce our dependency on the United States in those and other ways, this relationship remains imperative. It is critical. The problem along the way is, while we want to be close to the United States, we want to protect our national and cultural and economic sovereignty. We are a sovereign nation. Of course, we share much in common with the United States, but there's a lot to distinguish the two nations. And so Canadian nationalists, and I think rightly so, have said it's one thing to promote cooperation in areas that serve our interests, but you must always be aware of not crossing the line to the point that we are sacrificing our national character and our identity, our sovereignty, in order to placate the Americans. We've seen prime ministers and presidents disagree fundamentally over different conflicts. We've seen presidents and prime ministers disagree fundamentally over our treatment of world leaders. It continues to play out to this day. What did Prime Minister Carney do shortly after he got into office? He began to develop much stronger relations with our European allies, with our Asian allies, and our Latin American allies, because we know that while working alongside the United States gives us great strength, it can also become our Achilles heel. And when you have a president like Donald Trump, who has placed a target on Canada's back since the 2016 Republican presidential primaries, that's the kind of exposure we don't want. But the silver lining in all of that was it gave us the wake up call we needed to move forward and to, again, revisit what Mitchell Sharp and Pierre Trudeau and others said going back to the 70s and even before, that a strong Canada has to be one that both engages the United States, but despite the asymmetrical power relationship between the two of us, still can hold on to its national character, sovereignty, and identity.
There's a story I really like, which I'll briefly relate. I don't know if you remember that the time of the U.S. bicentennial, one of Canada's official gifts to the United States was a book called Between Friends, Entre Amis. And it was basically a series of photographs taken along the Canada-U.S. border. And I remember that in that book, there's a quote that reads something like, and again, I paraphrase, Canadians and Americans are exactly alike. You can't tell them apart. The best way to tell them apart is to make this observation to a Canadian. And I think that that kind of summarizes that tension that we've just been talking about.
It really does. And it's so fascinating since Trump returned to office as the 47th president, how Canadians have come together. And I was part of a panel a few months ago at Global Affairs on Canada's strategic sovereignty. And how does Canada, in this new climate with Donald Trump, be more strategic with regard to particular sectors? And the question that scholars have been asking themselves over the last several years is even when Donald Trump leaves office in a few years' time, will the effect of Trumpism disappear along with him? Or does this become the new normal for Canada US relations? So, I think everyone on the panel was in agreement that we have to be more strategic, more methodical. We know that Prime Minister Carney has established a new advisory body on Canada US relations. But I've had so many Americans approach me over the last several years saying, Don, if we could snap our fingers, we'd give up our American passports and move to Canada in a heartbeat. I was on the phone the other day ordering a book from a store in Chicago, and the person got on the phone, the owner, he said, Don, let me first say thank you for being Canadian. And so I think, we have a tendency to excoriate all Americans. We can't do that. We know that the country is fundamentally divided. Half supported Trump, more than half, less than half supported the Democrats. But we can tell the difference very easily. When Canadians travel abroad, we tend to stay in our own lane. We tend to be more understated. We are not a boastful people. We are a respectful people. And that comes out very, very clearly. And I think that's one of the many things that Canadians love about their country, that regardless of your background, what region of the country you come from, there's a bond that unites us. And since Trump returned to office, we have seen that play out in very significant and meaningful ways. But prime ministers still have to walk that tightrope, make sure they don't overstep, because we also know that there's still, an undercurrent of anti-Americanism in Canada that we also need to keep in check for political and economic reasons.
Well, and that kind of speaks to the next question I wanted to ask because Alan Rock is quoted in the book as saying that we've created a bond that is beyond practical. It borders on mystical. Now, that's quite a term to use. Why do you think he chose to frame our relationship with the Americans that way? What was he trying to put his finger on?
I think what he was trying to do, and I don't exactly agree with the terminology that he employed, it is a practical relationship. It's an important political relationship, but is it otherworldly? No, I don't think it is. And I think if anything, it has become a relationship that has undergone even closer scrutiny. Think about the time before 9/11 and Canadians living in border cities, even a fair distance from border cities, could travel to the United States and they could show their Canadian Tire card or their Loblaws card. 9/11 occurred. A narrative began to develop that several of the hijackers, in fact, had crossed that porous Canadian border into the United States. Of course, that was a myth that we had to combat for several months. Things changed dramatically after 9/11. And I think what Alan Rock was trying to get to was there's this a special aura around the Canada-US relationship because it stands out. It's unique. Is it mystical? I don't think so, because we've seen how easily tensions in the relationship can surface and how difficult it is to get the two countries back on track. If it was truly mystical, there'd be somebody, waving a magic wand saying all is good again. Well, I'm not
It's
saying,
not that simple.
right, it's not that simple. And we took great offense, and rightly so. And Canadians, as you know, have a very good sense of humor. When Trump insisted on referring to our prime minister as governor of Canada, of the 51st state, I can't think of any other leader in the world who would be allowed to get away with that. And again, we are a sovereign, proud country that has made its mark in very positive ways at times, unfortunately, in negative ways, to be fair about our history. But we are a very, very proud country. And I've been deeply moved by how unified we have become since Trump returned to office. And it's not just about Trump, he's a figurehead. It's about those advisors and Americans who've gotten on board with him and tried to convince him that Canada has been taking a free ride for years, and that is not true. They would never find a more loyal, competent, respectful ally, but we don't do well with bullies. And so we need to figure out an effective path forward.
Don, to wrap up, I'd like to ask you to pull out your crystal ball a little bit because, I mean, you well know that rumors of the demise of the special relationship have existed for decades. I mean, there have been ups and there have been downs, but those rumors haven't yet panned out. So, where do you think we go from here? And do you think that, as has often been said from a Canadian perspective, you neglect the relationship with the United States at your peril?
I do. I don't think we can ever afford to neglect our relationship with the United States. But we have to consider our alternatives. What options do we have? So I think what Prime Minister Carney is doing in terms of exploring other markets for our goods and services is important. This is something that we have focused on for years, but clearly this has stepped up. Diplomacy will remain very important, and it's hard to be diplomatic with a US president who doesn't believe in the norms and rules and principles of diplomacy. So when Trump steps down, of course, we're going to be dealing with someone else. It could be a Republican, it could be a Democrat, but we have to continue to make a strong case that not only does the relationship matter, we matter. So continue to engage in professionalization, our advocacy efforts, building coalitions with civil society, building coalitions with state governors, making sure we promote our goals south of the border and how it will also benefit the Americans. There will always be periods of cooperation and conflict. That goes without saying. It's about how we navigate and nurture and manage the relationship that in the end will determine our fate. Am I optimistic that we can get things back on track? I am, but it's going to take a whole lot of work because we don't, at this point, know how much of a lingering effect Trumpism will have internationally and on the bilateral relationship. So we have to remain vigilant, cautious. We can be optimistic, but we can't let our guard down.
Well, Don, I'd really like to thank you for having joined me on the podcast today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
My guest today was Don Abelson. His book, History Has Made Us Friends, Reassessing the Special Relationship Between Canada and the United States, was published by McGill Queen's University Press. You've been listening to Witness to Yesterday. To learn more about the Champlain Society, please visit our website at champlainsociety.ca. The best way you can support this podcast is by becoming a subscribing member of the Society. If you like what you've heard, let your friends know by forwarding this podcast through the social media of your choice. You can also send us an email at info@champlainsociety.ca. This podcast is made possible by the members of the Champlain Society who work hard to bring to life original documents in Canadian history. We'd also like to thank a number of Canadian scholarly book publishers, including the University of Toronto Press, UBC Press, and McGill Queen's University Press, for their financial support. My name is Larry Ostola. This interview was recorded on June the 8th, 2026. It was produced by Kevin Ball and supported by the University of Toronto Press Journal team, who also support the Champlain Society.